Everyone loves to listen to a good book, and there are so many wonderful ones to choose, so we decided to bring you this podcast of Stories Come to Life. Each episode features a story from either classic or modern literature, especially chosen to be interesting and exciting to hear. So sit back, relax, and listen to this story come to life. Welcome to Stories Come to Life. I am your host, Kathryn Lopez Luker. The passing of counterfeit money is continuing to affect people all around Bayport. Fenton Hardy believes the crooks' headquarters must be somewhere nearby. When the counterfeiters' actions affect the Hardy boys' own mother, they decide to go sleuthing to see if they can find out something that will help bring the criminals to light. Now sit back, relax, and listen to this story come to life. The Hardy Boys in the Secret of the Old Mill. Chapter 16. A Plan of Action. The quick work of the Hardy Boys and Tony Preto in capturing Paul Blum won them many compliments within the next few days. Even Chief Culloch grudgingly admitted that it had been a smart capture. In this he was perhaps largely prompted by a feeling that had Paul Blum made good his escape, he as chief would have come in for considerable criticism from the townspeople. As it was, the laxity at the city jail was forgotten in the excitement surrounding the fugitive's return, and Chief Culloch was correspondingly relieved. Had Paul Blum not been recaptured, the police force would have had to bear the brunt of public displeasure for having allowed the man to slip through their fingers. The connection of the Hardy Boys with the affair caused many people to recall their previous activities in the Tower Mansion case and the affair of the house on the cliff. "Those lads will be smart detectives yet," more than one person was heard to remark. Nothing could have pleased the boys more than recognition of the fact that they showed some ability in the profession of their famous father, and in the light of their recent successes, even Mrs. Hardy was beginning to abandon her prejudices against their desire to be someday more than amateur detectives. But although Paul Blum was safe in jail, counterfeit money was still being circulated in Bayport and Barmouth Village. Hardly a day passed that someone did not report to the police or to the banks that they had been the unwitting victims of the counterfeiters by cashing or accepting spurious bills. In one instance, it was a garage owner who had changed a $20 bill for a passing motorist who bought gasoline and oil. In another instance, even the steamship ticket office had accepted a false $5 bill for a ticket, and the mistake had not been discovered until the following day. When the ticket, which was bought at a cost of 80 cents, was traced by its number, it was found that it had never been presented on the steamboat. So many instances came to light that the entire city was on guard against the counterfeiters. But so excellent were the imitation bills, and so plausible were the excuses of those who sought to pass them on, that many people were victimized in spite of their caution. In some cases, merchants were handed counterfeit bills by responsible citizens of Bayport, people who were above reproach, and when the fact was pointed out, the would-be customers explained that they had received the money in good faith from equally reputable citizens. Often the original source of the bad money could not be traced. The counterfeit bills had passed through so many different hands without being discovered. The boys talked the matter over several times with their father, and one day Fenton Hardy took them into his confidence. "Don't tell anybody," he said, "but the federal agents have come across some evidence which makes them think the counterfeiting plant is located somewhere near Barmouth Village." "Have they got any definite idea, Dad?" asked Joe eagerly. "They think it's up in the woods, maybe at some farmhouse. You know the country over on the other side of the bay is pretty wild. There would be plenty of hiding places there for counterfeiters." Mr. Hardy spoke of several places that were being watched, but he admitted that so far the federal agents had uncovered little of practical value. They know that most of the bad money is circulated in this vicinity, and in and around Boston," he concluded. "It's just possible the plant may be in the hub." There the talk came to an end, and the boys walked away as they knew their father was getting ready for a hurried trip to the city. "It's a good chance for us to do some real detective work," said Frank to his brother one afternoon after school, as they were in the gymnasium in the barn back of the Hardy home. "The whole city is worked up over this counterfeit money business. Smarter detectives than we are working on the case," Joe pointed out, "but they haven't found much yet. Paul Blum won't talk. If we could get something out of him, we might have a clue to go on. He won't say a word. It's my opinion he doesn't know much about the source of the counterfeit money anyway. I think he was only an agent, set out to dispose of as much of it as he could. They probably have a dozen men traveling around the country, passing off these bad bills. Once the money gets into circulation, it's liable to pass through a dozen hands before it's discovered. Perhaps that man who stung the garage owner for $20 had no idea the money was bad. And perhaps it's the same way with the fellow who bought the ticket at the steamboat office. It's strange that most of the fuss is being raised right around this city. You don't hear much about it from other places." "It's my idea," said Frank, "that the counterfeiters have their plant right in this vicinity." "Do you think so?" "Just as you said. Most of the counterfeit money seems to be passed in and around Bayport. Where do you think they could be making the stuff?" Frank shrugged. "You never can tell. Perhaps in the cellar of one of the downtown buildings, for all we know. Personally, I've got an idea. It may be foolish, but I've been turning it over in my head for a few days, and the more I think of it, the more reasonable it seems. Spring it. You remember the day we were at the old mill? I'll say I do. Those fellows wouldn't let me dry my clothes in the mill after I'd fished that precious kid out of the water. But one of them offered us a reward, didn't he? Oh, well, you can't take a reward for that. That isn't what I'm getting at. Do you remember how the other man grabbed the bills out of his hand and then turned his back to us? Sure, he said he wanted to see if they were 5s or 1s, but it was rather funny that he turned his back to us. I thought so at the time. Still, he offered the money to us again. But was it the same money?" Joe was silent. The idea had not occurred to him before. "Do you mean," he said at last, "that perhaps the fellow changed the bills while he had his back turned?" "Exactly." "But why should he do that?" "Don't you see? Perhaps the first bills were counterfeit. Perhaps the man thought that if we took the counterfeit bills and later found out that they weren't good, we would remember where they came from and start an investigation. This is only a theory, remember, but perhaps the reason he took the bills from the man they called Doc was to change them for good bills, so that we would have no cause for suspicion." Joe nodded reflectively. "By gosh, Frank, there might be something to your idea after all. Say, perhaps that's where the counterfeiting plant is, right in the old mill. That's just what I've been driving at. There's something fishy about the old mill, for all their story that they're making a patent kind of breakfast food. That may be true, of course, but still, they didn't look very much like scientists to me. To me either. But how can we find out anything more about the place than we know already? They won't let anyone inside the mill, and it's quite evident that they don't want anyone around the place at all." "What made me suspicious," said Frank, "was the fact that Paul Blum seemed to be heading for the mouth of Willow River that afternoon when he got away in our motorboat. I began to wonder later if he might have been intending to make his way up as far as the old mill. Perhaps he is connected with the gang. It looks reasonable, but if we show our noses around there, they'll just chase us away. There's Lester." "Lester?" "The boy we saved from drowning. We have him on our side anyway, I think. If we haven't, he must be a very ungrateful beggar. I'd like to just ask him a few questions about this patent breakfast food yarn." "That's a good idea," cried Joe. "If he tells us any kind of story at all, we can soon tell if he's lying or not. But somehow, I don't think he would lie to us. He seemed to me to be a pretty decent sort of boy." "That's what I thought of him, too. Chances are, if these men are counterfeiters, they're keeping him there as a prisoner. He might be only too glad to tell what he knows, if given a chance. And if it turns out that those men really are scientists, and that the mill is really being used for this breakfast food stunt, we won't be making ourselves foolish by poking around and perhaps getting into all sorts of trouble for suspecting they were counterfeiters." Frank nodded. "That was my idea in suggesting Lester. We have to work pretty carefully, for it wouldn't do to start a hue and cry to find out that those fellows really are scientists after all. But what do you say to taking the motorcycles tomorrow morning and going up to the old mill to see if we can get to talking to the boy?" "I'm game. Tomorrow's Saturday. Even if the men at the mill do see us, they'll think we're just out on a holiday outing. There's no law against going near the old mill, even if they don't want strangers around." So the arrangement was made, and the Hardy boys laid their plans for a visit to the old mill on the following day. Each felt that there was something suspicious about the place, some mystery that was not entirely nor satisfactorily solved by the breakfast food explanation. If they could only talk to Lester, who was already under obligation to them for having saved his life, they felt that they would go a long way toward verifying or dispelling their suspicions regarding the three men who were the present occupants of the mill. Chapter 17. What Lester Said. The Hardy boys set out for the old mill on the following morning. They went up the shore road by motorcycle, then turned onto the deserted loop that led to the mill on the banks of the Willow River. When they came within sight of the river, they left their motorcycles under some trees by the roadside and went on their way on foot. They had brought fishing poles and fishing tackle with them. "We might as well enjoy ourselves while we're on this trip," Frank had said, in making the suggestion. "Besides, it gives us an excuse for being near the mill. There always was good fishing down by the pool near the mill race." They came out of the woods some distance above the mill and began to fish, working their way slowly down the river. By the time they had come within sight of the mill, Frank had caught 2 fish, and Joe had caught 1. The mill wheel was revolving slowly, and they could hear the muffled sound of machinery within the building. Down by the pool, they could see a lone figure moving about. "I believe that's Lester," exclaimed Joe. "That's who it is, all right," agreed his brother after a glance. "And he's fishing, too." Lester was standing on the bank of the pool, a fishing rod in his hand, but he did not seem to be very enthusiastic about the sport, for there was little eagerness in his expression as he eyed the motionless float on top of the water. Frank and Joe came slowly down the bank toward him, and he looked up at their approach. He recognized them immediately, and a smile came over his face. "Hello," he said shyly. "Hello, Lester," they greeted him back. "Any luck?" None yet," admitted the lad. "I don't care for fishing anyway." "There's supposed to be plenty of fish in this pool," Frank told him. Lester shrugged his shoulders. "I suppose so. I've caught quite a few, but when you haven't anything to do but fish all day long, you don't care for it so much." "Is that all you do?" asked Joe. "That's all. It's mighty lonesome living at this old mill all the time." "Why don't you go down to the city once in a while?" "Uncle Doc won't let me." The boy was evidently lonely and glad to see them. He sat down on the bank and forgot his fishing in his delight at being able to talk to boys of his own age. "Do you go to school?" he asked wistfully. The Hardy boys nodded. "Every day?" "Every day but Saturdays and Sundays." "I wish I could go to school. You fellows are lucky." Joe and Frank looked at one another. This was the first time they had ever met anyone who considered that they were fortunate in being able to go to school. "I suppose we are," admitted Frank with a smile, "although sometimes we don't think so." "Are there lots of other fellows at school?" "Quite a few." Lester sighed. "Gee, I wish I could go," he said. "But Uncle Doc won't let me go anywhere." "Where did you come from?" asked Frank. "Washington. But even there I didn't know any of the boys. Uncle Doc keeps me with him all the time. But he says we'll be rich someday, and then I can have all the friends I want." "What does your uncle do for a living?" inquired Joe. "Why, he runs the mill," answered the boy, evidently surprised by the question. "But what does he make? Breakfast food?" "I don't know. I don't know much about it. Uncle Doc never tells me anything." "Did he move any new machinery into the mill?" asked Frank. "Oh, when we first came here there was a lot of new machinery put in. It's all in a back room." "What does it look like?" Joe inquired lazily. "I've never seen it. It's in a stone room and they keep the door locked all the time. Uncle Doc boxed my ears once when he saw me near the door." "Have you ever seen any of the breakfast food?" The boy shook his head. "I've never seen any yet." "Do they ship it all out?" Lester hesitated. Once in a while, Mr. Markle goes to the city with some packages, but they're never very large." "Is Mr. Markle related to you?" "No, I never saw the other two men before Uncle Doc brought me here." "Is he your real uncle?" "Oh, yes. He's looked after me for about a year now, ever since my father died." "Is he good to you?" asked Frank. Sometimes, but he won't let me go to school or have any friends, and if I don't do just as he says, he beats me." "What did he do when he lived in Washington?" inquired Joe. "Did he make breakfast food there, too?" The boy laughed. "Ha! He didn't do very much of anything. He used to go out at night a lot and leave me all alone. Sometimes he wouldn't come back until nearly morning. He told me he was working in a factory. But sometimes funny-looking men would call on him, and they'd talk for a long time." "And he's never told you anything about the breakfast food?" "Nothing." "How long do you think you'll be here?" "I don't know. Uncle Doc says we may be here for a month yet, but he always has a valise packed, so we can go any time." The Hardy boys looked at one another significantly. Was the patent breakfast food enterprise legitimate or illegitimate? From what the boy had said, there appeared to be grounds for suspicion. It did not seem that Uncle Doc was a scientist after all. "I wish we were rich now," said Lester. "I'd like to go away from here and go to school. I wish Uncle Doc would move into Bayport so I could go to school with you fellows, but I guess there isn't much chance of that." "Your uncle is pretty sure he's going to be rich?" said Frank. "Oh, yes, he's told me often that we'll be rich someday, and that I could have all the friends I wanted then." "He must expect the breakfast food to be a success." "I suppose so." "Has he ever bought any grain from the farmers around here?" inquired Joe. The boy shook his head. "No. Some people tried to sell grain to him, but he wouldn't buy it." "Then what is he making the breakfast food out of?" The boy shrugged his shoulders indifferently. "I don't know," he answered vaguely. "I don't know much about it. He never tells me anything, and he never lets me into the workroom." That was the sum and substance of Lester's knowledge of the activities of his Uncle Doc and his two associates. The boy did not seem to object to being questioned. It was plain that he was so lonesome that he welcomed the opportunity of talking to someone. And the more the Hardy boys interrogated him, the more convinced they were that their suspicions of Uncle Doc and the other two men were not unfounded. "Doesn't he make you do any work?" asked Frank. "I have to chop wood once in a while and bring up water from the spring, but there's not much to do. It's pretty dull here. I wish there was more work for me to do, but mostly I just fish and swim and hang around." "Doesn't he let you help him in the mill?" No, I've offered to help, but none of them will let me come into the workroom. Workroom? Don't they use the whole mill? Only the stone room where the new machinery is. And the old machinery isn't being used at all? No. At that moment there was an interruption. A shout from the mill attracted their attention, and looking up, they saw Uncle Doc standing in the doorway. "Lester!" he bellowed angrily. "Yes?" "Come up here this minute," ordered the old man. He left the door and came down the slope toward the river. "Now I'm in for it," said the boy. "I suppose he'll be angry now because I was talking to you." Uncle Doc was indeed angry. As he came up to the group, he was muttering beneath his breath. "Get back up to the mill, you young rascal," he ordered, giving Lester a cuff on the side of the head. "How often have I told you not to be talking to strangers? You talk too much altogether. Get back up to the mill and stay there." "We were just chatting," began the boy, but Uncle Doc silenced him with a blow. With an appealing glance at the Hardy boys, Lester began to make his way back up the slope toward the mill. Uncle Doc turned toward Joe and Frank, surveying them resentfully. "What are you doing loafing around here?" he demanded. "We're not loafing. We've been fishing in the river," said Frank. "Not that it's any of your business, so far as I can see." "I'll make it my business," thundered Uncle Doc. "You two fellows had better stay away from here after this. We don't want you hanging around here." "The river is free," Joe reminded him. "Keep away from this here mill, or I'll make it hot for you. What was that rascal of a boy telling you?" "We were just talking," replied Frank evasively. "Well, don't talk to him again. I don't want him mixing up with all the riffraff of the country and talking to every Tom, Dick, and Harry that comes around. I'll thank you to stay away from here after this." Whereupon Uncle Doc, still grumbling indignantly, went stamping up the slope again toward the mill. The Hardy boys, not a bit alarmed by the outburst, but feeling that they had gained valuable information that day, began to move slowly down the river bank, away from the vicinity of the old mill. Chapter 18. Suspicions. "What do you think, Joe?" asked Frank, as they were speeding back to Bayport on their motorcycles. "I don't think Uncle Doc is a scientist any more than I am." "That's my opinion, too. Why should they have so much secrecy about a new kind of breakfast food? Why won't they even let Lester into the workroom with them? Something fishy about it, and it's plain by now that Uncle Doc doesn't like strangers around the place. That poor kid must lead a lonely life with that gang. It's a wonder he doesn't run away from them. He has no place else to go, I suppose." "He seems a nice sort of chap, too," Joe answered. "Well, we didn't get anything definite from him, but we know enough to make us mighty suspicious of what's going on in that old mill." "I'd just like to get a look at that machinery in the secret room the boy mentioned." Frank was silent for a while. "I wish Uncle Doc hadn't seen us there today. It'll make it awkward now if we ever go back. He's told us to stay away, and now he'll be suspicious if he ever sees us around there again. We might tell Dad what we know about the place." But Frank vetoed this suggestion. "I'd rather work along our own lines until we get something more definite," he said. "If we get some real evidence, we can tell Dad about it. So far we have nothing to go on but our own suspicions." All the way back to Bayport, the Hardy boys discussed the various aspects of the case, and although they agreed that the mysterious activities of the three men at the old mill tended to indicate almost anything but scientific endeavors, they realized that if they investigated too thoroughly, they might get into serious trouble. "We'll just wait a while and keep our ears open," Frank decided. "If those fellows are in the counterfeiting game, they'll do something to give themselves away. And then we'll be right on the job." When the boys arrived home, they amused themselves in the gymnasium in the barn for some time, had an impromptu boxing match, and finally, after a shower bath, went down the street. It was a sleepy Saturday afternoon, and the city was very quiet. "Nothing much going on around here," remarked Frank. "We should have stayed out in the country." "We could go out in the motorboat for a while." "Fine, let's go." But at that moment, they heard the whistle of the afternoon express. Like most boys, they had a weakness for trains. There was a fascination about the great locomotives that held them spellbound, and they liked nothing better than to watch the trains that passed through Bayport, and to speculate on the towns and cities they had come from or were bound for. At times, when school became exceptionally distasteful, they had often gone down to the railway station and wished they could board the first train that came by, to travel on to strange countries. Somehow they had never been so daring as to do this, common sense invariably coming to the rescue, but the lure of locomotives and shining rails still held them in its grasp. They moved down the street toward the station and came out on the platform just as the express was pulling in. Idly, they watched the few passengers who emerged from the coaches, envied the engineer who was lolling majestically in the cab, watched the conductor in his smart uniform, and looked at the people who were boarding the train. Suddenly, Frank nudged his brother. "Isn't that Markle?" he asked. Joe followed his glance. Near the steps of one of the Pullman coaches was a familiar figure, with cap pulled down over his eyes. There was no mistaking the fellow. He was indeed Markle, one of the associates of Uncle Doc at the old mill. What particularly attracted the boys' attention, however, was the fact that Markle carried a bulky paper package under his arm. He had not seen them, but there was something so furtive in his manner that the Hardy boys made themselves as inconspicuous as possible in the shadow of one of the pillars nearby. Markle lounged about near the coach, now and then glancing up anxiously, as though expecting someone. Within a few minutes, just as the conductor shouted, "All aboard!" a tall, thin-faced man with a neat black mustache emerged from the coach. He glanced hastily down at Markle, nodded swiftly, said something in a low tone, and Markle forthwith handed him the package. The tall man snatched it from his grasp, turned, and retreated quickly into the coach again. Markle, as soon as this transaction had been completed, gave a shrug of his shoulders, as though he had been relieved of an unpleasant burden, turned swiftly on his heel, and walked away. He disappeared into the station just as the train began to pull out. The whole affair had occupied but a few seconds, and had passed almost unnoticed by anyone on the platform, save the Hardy boys. Any who may have noticed the handing over of the package doubtless attached little importance to it. The Hardy boys themselves would not have given it more than a passing glance, had it not been for Markle's connection with the mystery of the old mill. "What do you make of that, Frank?" "Markle must have passed on a sample of the new breakfast food. He seemed mighty secretive about it." "I'll say he did. You'd think it was a bomb he was handing over, instead of breakfast food. He waited until the train was just pulling out before the other man came for it." "No breakfast food about that performance." "I don't think so either. Evidently, Markle and the gang are in touch with someone in the city. You remember that Lester said Markle came to Bayport every little while with a package under his arm? That must have been one of them." "Well, that's a little more evidence to go on. Give 'em enough rope and they'll hang themselves. I'll just bet dollars to doughnuts that there is counterfeit money in that package instead of breakfast food. This man Markle looks to me like a crook, and his tall friend on the train didn't look any too trustworthy either. My idea is that they're using the mill as a plant, where they turn out the money. Then they give it to one of their men on the train, and he takes it to some other city for distribution." "That looks like it," Joe agreed. You could tell that Markle had something on his conscience when he handed that package over. He looked mighty shifty about it." The boys walked back down the street, still discussing the events of the day. They spent the rest of the afternoon out in Barmet Bay, in the Sleuth. For the time being, they dismissed the affair of the mill from their minds, being content, as Frank had said, that the counterfeiters, if they were such, would ultimately betray themselves. When they returned home that evening for supper, they did not tell their father what they had learned, but Fenton Hardy himself brought up the question of counterfeit money, when he told them that he had that afternoon received a telegram from federal authorities, asking him to further his investigations. "They have had evidence that more than $10,000 in counterfeit money was put into circulation within the past 3 days, he told the boys. "The affair is going beyond all bounds." "And Paul Blum is still silent?" asked Frank. "Can't get a word out of him. I am inclined to believe he doesn't know anything about the men who are at the head of the organization. I think he was only a tool, employed to get the money in circulation. But I wish you two lads would keep on the lookout for any clues. It'll help me a lot if we can run these counterfeiters to earth. Then, besides, there is a big reward." "We'll do our best," they promised. And secretly, they wondered what Fenton Hardy would think if he knew how much work they had already put on the case, and how much evidence they had already gathered, tending to indicate that the old mill on Willow River was in some way connected with the activities of the counterfeiting gang. "If you can get anything definite in this case," said Fenton Hardy with a smile, "I'll be ready to admit that you have some abilities as detectives." "Oh, Fenton, don't encourage them," objected Mrs. Hardy. "Nonsense, Laura," he replied. "If they want to be detectives, and if they have the talent for it, you might as well try to keep water from running downhill as to stop them. They've done good work on 2 difficult cases already." "And I have a hunch that we'll do something on this case, too," said Frank, with confidence. Chapter 19. The Rug Buyer. 2 days later an event occurred that brought the activities of the counterfeiters much closer home. Frank and Joe returned from school on Monday afternoon to find their mother in a state of great agitation. The moment they entered the house, they could tell that something unusual had happened, for Mrs. Hardy was sitting by the living-room table, gazing disconsolately at a great heap of bills in her lap. "Where did you get all the money, Mother?" asked Frank jokingly at first, but his expression became serious when he saw the anxiety and distress in Mrs. Hardy's face. Her fingers were trembling as she picked up the bills and put them on the table. "What's the matter?" asked Joe quickly. "What's wrong?" Mrs. Hardy got up and walked across the room toward the window. She looked out at the street for a while, then turned to her sons. "You didn't see a foreign rug buyer around the streets this afternoon, did you?" she asked them. The Hardy boys shook their heads. "Just came from school," they told her. "We didn't meet anybody on the way." Suddenly Frank glanced at the floor. "Why, you've sold the rug!" he exclaimed in surprise. The living-room floor had hitherto been covered by a valuable old Persian rug, as soft as moss. It had been bought by Mr. Hardy when on a trip to the city, but Mrs. Hardy had never cared for it. Fenton Hardy had thought to surprise his wife when he brought the rug home, but in a masculine indifference to color schemes, he had neglected to see to it that the rug matched the rest of the room. Its color was not what Mrs. Hardy wanted, and inasmuch as the rug had been purchased at an exclusive sale, they had found it impossible to exchange it at the time. Mrs. Hardy had always said that if she had an opportunity, she would get rid of the rug and purchase something different. However, the opportunity was long in coming. Although she had received several offers for it, none of these had been for more than $500. "And," as she said, "I refused to sell a $900 rug for that price." Now, as the Hardy boys noticed, the rug was gone. "How much did you get for it?" asked Joe eagerly. "I gave it away." "Gave it away?" they exclaimed. Mrs. Hardy nodded. "Not intentionally. I've been cheated." "How?" demanded Frank quickly. Mrs. Hardy motioned toward the money. "I've just been to the bank to deposit that money." "You don't mean to say it's counterfeit?" "So the bank cashier told me." Frank sat down heavily in the nearest chair. "Well, I'll be darned!" he exclaimed. "How did this happen? How much did they sting you for?" $800, answered Mrs. Hardy gravely. Joe whistled in surprise. "How did it happen?" "He came here shortly after you boys left for school," began Mrs. Hardy. "It must have been a little before 2 o'clock. "Who came here?" "The rug buyer. He was a strange little fellow, very short and dark. He was foreign, you could tell by his appearance. He didn't speak very good English. He had dark hair and little keen black eyes. He came up to the front door and asked me if I wanted to buy rugs. When I told him I didn't want to buy any, he asked if I had any to sell. He said he was a traveling rug merchant, and that he went from city to city, buying and selling and trading rugs." "So you told him about the living room rug?" suggested Frank. "I just thought of it then, and I thought it might be a good chance to get rid of it, and perhaps get a better rug in its stead. I mentioned that I had a rug that I might sell, but I told him I didn't think he could pay the price." "And he asked to see it anyway?" Frank went on. "When I told him I didn't think he could buy it, he merely laughed in a very shrewd sort of way, and said that money was no object to him, that he had bought rugs costing as much as $2,000 and turned them over at a profit. So I asked him to come into the house, and the moment he saw the rug he admired it very much. He asked me how much I wanted for it, so I told him I wanted $900. Of course I didn't expect to get that much, because that's all the rug cost, but these fellows always haggle over price, so it's best to name a good stiff figure right at the start." The Hardy boys smiled at this evidence of their mother's shrewdness. "He said he wouldn't give me $900, but he offered $700. I told him that his price was ridiculous, but asked if he had any rugs he wanted to trade for it. He looked rather dubious when I mentioned a trade, and said that while he carried some medium-priced rugs with him, he carried nothing that could equal the one I wished to sell." "Did he say where he kept those other rugs?" Frank asked. "He said they were at his hotel, but that his more valuable rugs were all in the city, and that it would take a day or so before he could have them sent here. However, he said that he would buy the rug from me for $800 and take a chance on being able to sell me a good rug when he should have them sent down from the city." "Fair enough," remarked Joe. "It seemed fair enough to me, for of course the rug was worth only about $800, perhaps less, because it has been used for several months. I was under no obligation to buy a new rug from him unless I wished, so I accepted his offer and he paid me the money." $800? "In cash. He seemed to carry a great deal of money in a heavy leather wallet. He gave me the money in 50s and 5s, and I thought it very well of myself for making such a good bargain." "Until you came to bank the money," Frank said. "Until I came to bank the money." The cashier glanced at the bills, then told me he was sorry but he couldn't accept them. For a moment I didn't understand him because I had forgotten all about this scare about counterfeit money and hadn't given the matter a thought. Then he told me that the bills were counterfeit, so there really was nothing left for me to do but to come back home, realizing that I had been very neatly tricked. "But perhaps you haven't been tricked after all," suggested Frank. "It may be possible that the rug buyer didn't realize the money was bad." "Did he say what hotel he was staying at?" "Yes, he told me, but I called up the police and asked them to find him for me." They investigated and found that there has been no rug buyer staying at that hotel all week, nor at any other hotel in Bayport, so far as they could find.
That doesn't look so good.
What's more, they made inquiries at the station and found that a man answering to his description had taken the early afternoon train out. He took the rug with him, not only my rug, but a rug that he had bought from another woman in Bayport.
He'll probably sell him in some other town.
Just what he did. They found that he had bought a ticket to the next city, but when they got in touch with the police there, they found that he had sold 2 rugs to a wholesale firm and disappeared. He sold my rug for $500 and the other one for $300.
Did he give the other woman counterfeit money too?
Yes.
He sure cleaned up on that afternoon's work, remarked Frank. He didn't lose any time in getting away either.
If I had only gone to the bank early, it might have been different, said Mrs. Hardy. As it was, I got there only a few minutes before 3 o'clock, and by the time I got in touch with the police, and by the time they'd tried to trace the man here and later found out where he'd gone, you know how slow they are, it was too late.
I guess there's no chance of seeing him back in 2 days with the rug he wanted to sell you, observed Frank.
Either he is in league with the counterfeiters, or else he was stung himself for a lot of counterfeit money, and decided to get rid of it as soon as possible. Mrs. Hardy was downcast. I should have been on my guard, she said. There's been so much of this bad money going around that I should have been on watch for it, especially with a big sum like $800. It's my own fault, I suppose, but it's hard to lose that much money. She glanced at the heap of bills on the table. It's not worth the paper it's printed on.
Frank picked up one of the bills and examined it. Looks just like the 5 that fellow passed on to Joe and me at the station, he commented, testing the quality of the paper. It comes from the same source, I'll bet.
$800, Joe exclaimed. That's the biggest haul yet.
I'd like to have that rug merchant by the back of the neck right this minute. I'd shake the 800 out of him in a hurry.
I guess there's not much chance of catching him now. He's sold the rugs and made his getaway. Mrs. Hardy was silent. She felt the loss of the valuable rug very keenly, and still more keenly did she feel the shame of having been imposed upon after all the warnings that had been circulated regarding counterfeit money. But the rug merchant had been so plausible, and, as she was an unsuspecting woman by nature, she had never for a moment considered the possibility of trickery.
We'll go down and have a chat with the police, said Frank, getting up, although I'm afraid it won't do much good. Chief Collig will tell us that he's busy following up clues, remarked Joe with a laugh, and that's as far as he'll ever get.
This proved to be the case. When the boys reached the police station, they found Chief Collig and Detective Smuff in the midst of a game of pinochle, and averse to being disturbed. When they inquired if there had been any further information regarding the rug merchant, Chief Collig shook his head.
We're following up some clues, he said gravely, but there hasn't been any more trace of him.
Not a trace, corroborated Detective Smuff, with a portentous frown. Do you think he'll be arrested? Asked Frank. Chief Collig looked up.
Of course he'll be arrested, he declared. Didn't I say we're following up clues? We'll have the fellow behind bars all right. I'm working on the case myself, said Detective Smuff, examining his cards wearily. Rely on us, advised the chief. Your play, Smuff.
The boys retired. Somehow they got the impression that the Bayport Police Department was not exerting a great deal of effort to try to capture the fraudulent rug buyer. Chapter 20. A Note of Warning. 3 days later, Fenton Hardy, who had been away from home on business, received a note. No one saw the man who left it at the door. The Hardy boys were at school, and Mrs. Hardy was busy in the kitchen. She heard the front doorbell ring and went to answer it. But when she opened the door, there was no one in sight. She looked out and saw a man walking briskly down the opposite side of the street. A woman with a baby carriage was strolling past the house, and farther down the street, 2 men were standing talking on the corner. Somewhat surprised, and imagining that her ears must have deceived her, she was about to close the door when she became aware of a white object that had fluttered to her feet. It was a cheap envelope, sealed, and with the name of Fenton Hardy written on it in pencil. Mrs. Hardy picked it up, examined it curiously, then brought it into the house and placed it on the table in her husband's study. It was not an unusual occurrence to have letters left at the door in this manner, as occasionally anonymous letters were left for the detective, giving him hints or advice concerning cases on which he was engaged. To most of these he paid no attention, although sometimes valuable information was brought to his notice in this manner. This, Mrs. Hardy judged, was another such communication, which was why the person who delivered it had been careful to hurry away after ringing the bell. Mr. Hardy did not return home until late that afternoon. He had been over to Barmouth Village, where the federal authorities were closely watching 2 men thought to be in league with the counterfeiters. Mr. Hardy had followed one man to a nearby city and seen the fellow pass a small package to a woman in black, who had quickly disappeared in a crowd. But the noted detective knew the woman, and knew where she could be located when wanted. The boys had arrived back home from school, had left their books at the house, and had set out with Chet Morton for a cruise in the motorboat. When Mr. Hardy came back, he glanced over his mail and was settling down to read the evening paper when his wife remembered the note that had been left at the door that afternoon. "Someone left a letter for you this afternoon," she said. "I heard the doorbell ring, but when I went to answer it, there was no one at the door. I picked up the letter, though, and I put it on your study table." Fenton Hardy went into the study and picked up the letter, slitting open the envelope. Within was a thin sheet of cheap paper on which had been written a few lines in pencil. He read the message with a slow smile, then handed the paper over to his wife. "Someone's trying to scare me," he said. She picked up the note. In a crude, ill-formed hand she read the following: "Better give up this counterfeit case, or we'll take the shirt off your back. We know this game too well. Let this be a warning to you. Poor Blum is a rank outsider. Better let him go." Mrs. Hardy looked up anxiously. "What are you going to do about this note?" she asked. The detective shrugged. "Ignore it, of course." "But they may harm you." "They may try, but they won't be the first ones who've tried to frighten me away from a case." "But they must be right in Bayport to deliver a note like this." "I've suspected all along that their headquarters were here. Don't worry, Lara. I'm not afraid of them." "But I do worry. They're desperate men. They'll stop at nothing." Fenton Hardy laughed. "It isn't the first time I've been threatened. It's only a bluff. I'll stay right on the case, although so far I haven't been able to make much progress on it. But this matter of the note is adding insult to injury, don't you think? First of all, they send one of their men around here to fool us to the extent of $800 with their counterfeit money. And now they try to frighten me away from handling the case any further." Fenton Hardy looked at the note again, then replaced it carefully in the envelope. "You didn't see anyone on the street after the doorbell rang?" he asked. "Oh, there were 3 or 4 people walking by, but I didn't notice any of them particularly. They all seemed quite average people. None of them looked at all suspicious." "The chap that delivered the note was probably hiding around the corner of the house until you went inside again. That's usually their scheme. It wouldn't have done much good if you'd have seen him. Probably some chap they picked up on the street and bribed to slip the note into the door." "I don't like it." At that moment, Frank and Joe came into the house, flushed from their outing on the bay. They were laughing at the recollection of some remarkable acrobatic feats that Chet Morton had attempted on the bow of the motorboat, the result of which had been the sudden immersion of Chet in the chilly waters of the bay. He had just left them, his clothes dripping wet, heading for home on his motorcycle, vowing that he could have stood on his hands on the bow, if only Frank hadn't steered to the left when he should have steered to the right. "However," he said cheerfully, "I missed my bath last Saturday night anyway, so this'll make up for it." The Hardy boys recounted their adventures, and after Fenton Hardy had chuckled over the plight of Chet, he tossed over the mysterious letter to them. "What do you think of that?" he asked of the boys. Frank and Joe read the scrawled warning with interest. "Trying to frighten you away from the case, are they?" said Frank, as he gave back the note. "Looks like it." "You won't pay any attention to it, though, of course?" "Not a bit. Although your mother seems to think I'll be carried home on a stretcher any day." "When did the note come?" Joe inquired with deep interest. Mrs. Hardy told them how the strange letter had been delivered, and when they learned that it had been left at the door instead of being sent through the post office, both boys became immediately excited. They did not, however, air their suspicions at the time, and it was not until they were alone after supper that they discussed the topic between them. "That settles it," declared Frank with finality. "The counterfeiters must be right here in Bayport, or nearby. That's what I mean. If they were out of town, the letter would have been sent by the mail. It's getting to be a little too much. As Dad said, it was adding insult to injury. Tricking Mother to the extent of $800, and now sending an impudent note like that. It's up to us to use what we know." "You mean to see if we can find out anything more about the mill?" "I mean to find out everything there is to be found out about it." "I'm with you. When do we start?" "When should we?" "Tonight." "So soon?" "Why not?" "It's all right with me." "If we're going to go back there at all, we may as well get it over with as soon as we can," said Frank. "I've been thinking over a way to get away with it. And I think we should be able to get inside that place and investigate it without much trouble." "How?" "Do you remember how Carl Stummer remarked that you looked something like Lester?" "Yes, and there is a bit of resemblance, too. You are about the same build, and you both have fair curly hair. I think you should be able to impersonate him if we went out there at night. At a distance, and at night time, they might mistake you for him, even if we were discovered." "I never thought of that," Joe admitted. "It isn't a bad idea. I'm willing to try it. It'll be risky, of course, but I'm practically convinced that the old mill is where this counterfeit money is coming from. The only way we'll ever find out is to go out there ourselves. If we told the town police what we suspected, they would only laugh at us, and probably they'd be so clumsy about taking any action that the counterfeiters would get wind of it. The only way is to keep it to ourselves and go out there quietly and see what we can find." "How will we get out tonight? Mother won't let us go. She'll be afraid we'll get hurt." "I hate to do anything underhand, but it's our only chance. We'll go out for a motorcycle trip this evening, and as soon as it gets dark, we'll head for the mill. We should reach there about 10 o'clock. We'll park the bikes a good distance away from the mill so they won't hear us coming, and then we'll walk the rest of the way. If we get the goods on the counterfeiters, we'll be heroes. If we don't, we'll catch a lecture for staying out late. We'll just have to take our chances on that, but I think that if everything goes well, we won't get any lecture." "How will we get into the mill?" asked Joe. "We'll have to wait until we get there before we lay our plans. I've sort of forgotten the layout of the place, but if we work it right, I think we should be able to get inside. I'd like to get into that mysterious stone room that Lester mentioned, and see what sort of machinery they have in there. I'll bet it's an engraving plant and a printing press instead of a patent breakfast food machine. What if we're caught? That's a chance we're taking. We've got to risk it. What if we find that the place is really the headquarters of this counterfeit gang? Look at it that way. So for the rest of the evening, the boys were conspicuously studious. They were occupied with their books until twilight fell, after which Frank yawned and murmured that he'd like a breath of fresh air. "I think I'll go out on a little spin on the motorcycle," he said casually. "I'll go with you," observed Joe promptly. Fenton Hardy looked up. "Yes, you've been in the house all evening. Go ahead." "Don't be long," advised Mrs. Hardy. "We won't be any longer than we can help," said Frank mysteriously. With that, the Hardy boys left the house and went out to the garage for their motorcycles. They drove around the streets of Bayport for some time, until at last it grew darker. Then they headed their machines out toward the shore road. The moon was just rising over the bay when they left the city, and they drove at a good speed into the country. "Now to tackle the old mill," exclaimed Frank. This is your host, Kathryn Lopez Luker. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Stories Come to Life. Be sure to join us next time when we continue to listen to the adventures of the Hardy Boys in The Secret of the Old Mill. I'd love to hear from you, so please send an email to me at kluker@marshallpl.org. I'll talk to you again soon.